Welcome to Beyond Stereo, the Dolby Atmos podcast. I'm Dan Bucknell, and here we talk about the world of immersive technologies aimed at creating a more meaningful and emotional experience for music, film, and everything else. All right, joining us today, we've got Luke C. Jackson. Welcome, man. How are you going?
Good, thanks. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks for coming on. We've been working together for a long time now on plenty of different things, but let our audience know what you do and what exactly a day looks like for you.
You know, I mean, I'm always working on different things. That's the thing. And so, you know, I might be writing a novel, working on a graphic novel. So writing the script for that. I might be working with you on the final parts of one of my brother's film. I could be working on anything. I mean, I've done some ghostwriting recently and things like that. So there's, it's always been unpredictable from a creative standpoint. But I guess everything I do when we're talking about the creative part of my life, everything I do is bound by storytelling. So I've always been a storyteller, always considered myself a storyteller from, you know, probably when I was about, I guess, 10, 12, right up until now.
Wow. Yeah. So how did you get into that then? Like, I think we've maybe talked about this before, but like what was the first thing that made you realize I just really want to tell stories?
I remember being very keen. I sort of loved telling stories when I was about 10. And at 12, I remember I swapped schools. And, you know, when you change schools, there's a bit of, it can be a bit tough to make friends and things like that. And one of the things that I found myself doing was creating these stories. So I wrote these little mystery stories. They were just 5-minute mysteries, right? I mean, I don't think I've ever even heard of that, but I did that. I wrote that, and so there'd be a sort of premise, and something had happened, and it was maybe a little whodunit or whatever, and then I'd go around to the other classes and read these things and get people to shout out, was it him? And this sort of stuff, and then I'd give the solution at the end.
That's awesome. Okay, so you started very young then. That sounds like you had an audience participation thing going on straight away. That's really cool.
Well, I think so. I mean, that was 12. So yes, that's pretty early on. It's pretty early on.
Yeah.
But funnily enough, I mean, my next. Sorry, you are.
Sorry, I was going to say, what grade is that? That's grade 5 or something now?
Grade 6.
Grade 6. Okay.
I changed schools in grade 6. So yeah,
it's cool. And go ahead with what you were going to say.
Yeah, I guess what I did after that was kind of, I think at the same time I was drawing as well. I loved drawing when I was very young. And, you know, I can see this with one of my daughters now, you know, there's just that thing of, you know, picking up that pencil and wanting to tell that story on paper. I can definitely remember doing a lot of that from when I was very, very young. And I continued that right through high school, and I was particularly influenced by comic artists of the time. So probably more by the artists than by the writers at that time. Right. And particularly, you know, for anyone of my age, I reckon, who was reading comics at the time, Todd McFarlane was probably the most influential artist. I mean, there were others, you know, Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld and people, but for me, the dynamism that he managed to create, Todd McFarlane managed to create in his images, particularly of Spider-Man, who, you know, was my favorite character. It just inspired me so much. So my drawings were very McFarlane influenced for a number of years. Yeah.
That's great. Okay. Well, with the drawing, I mean, that's something I think probably a lot of creatives start with, you know, maybe an image in their head of what something is going to look like, or, you know, having that finished product thing, and then you kind of work backwards. Is that sort of how maybe your entire career kind of started that way? Did you what were you going for when you did this? Were you shooting for I want to become a illustrator or a writer, or did it just kind of happen? Like how did that become?
No, that's why I say I'm a storyteller, and because actually I never had an endpoint in mind. I mean, I remember John Marsden came out. So John Marsden, for anyone who's international, they might be familiar with his film anyway, Tomorrow When the War Began, which is called When the War Began in America. But he, you know, is best-selling young adult author in a time when really young adult fiction wasn't very highly regarded, right? And he came out to my school. I was a very conservative school for 4 years, which I Yeah, and so I was there, and in year eight, he came out and he was speaking to the entire. He spoke to the cohort. You know, however many there were about 300, maybe 400 of us in this very dark wooden hall. You know, all wearing our navy blue suits and our ties done right up.
Wow.
And he said, does anyone out there want to be a writer when they grow up? And I put up my hand, and I was the only one who put up his hand. Right.
Really? Okay. Wow.
Um, I mean, I guess you might, that inkling there that maybe writing could be a way to. But again, I really just think at that time I was actually doing more art than I was writing, and I was painting. I painted all the sets, for example, for the school play that year, and so really it was just this way of. Funnily enough, I now realize I always describe myself as a storyteller, but I think over the last little while, and I think this ties into maybe why you wanted to get me on this podcast in particular, is because I actually think that as much as anything else, I'm a world builder. And that's something that I started, whether I was telling little detective stories or whether I was painting those sets for the plays, whether I was drawing superheroes, and I would start off. I had one character that I came up with called Flintlock, and he was going to, he's going to have these electric powers and all this sort of stuff. I remember that, but he would have a gang of people, like the Avengers, that he'd be hanging out with, and so and being a superhero alongside, but the moment you start in comics, the moment you start sort of telling a story, you are telling a story in a world. And so you can't separate it from that. Flintlock or Spider-Man or, one of my characters these days, they don't just exist as a character. They exist as a character within a world, not a setting, because I can come back to that, but within a world.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And we often talk a lot about, immersion, of course, the Dolby Atmos podcast, but also at the same time, just you and me, we've had lots and lots of conversations about, like the meaning of, like not just the story itself, but, a bigger context that allows it to feel real. It's not just that scene that is taking place. There's sort of an implied thing that it exists within something that even when you're not watching it, it continues, and that makes it feel real. And I suppose that relates to when you are expressing yourself in any form, it's more about building something that wasn't there before, that you had an urge or need to see become realized, and that's where it becomes realized. And so I think that's really interesting. I had very similar things when I was younger as well. I also painted the sets of the school play. I remember that when I was in, I think I was maybe prep or grade one or something, and I was signing up to do that. I very much relate. I think, creating things in any form, whether it's music, films, or comics, or anything, a podcast now, it doesn't matter. It's all, something that starts with a cool idea that you just want to see real. And if it doesn't exist already, you find a way to make it,
Mm.
So,
Absolutely.
so I guess let's talk a little bit about some of the books you've written, because you're a published author, and I remember I've actually read for one of them way back in the day. What was the first book that you published in a professional setting?
Yeah, first novel I had published was called The Unclaimed, and it was I think that's probably the one that you read back all that time ago. That was a long time ago now. It was about 19 years ago, I believe.
Wow,
that was my first published novel. Yeah, I got my first novel published, I think when I was around 25, that sort of. So yeah, and so that was I described it as like the Secret Seven meets Goosebumps or something, So it was a sort of a creepy kind of a spooky sort of a Secret Seven type novel. So for that sort of 12-year-old to kind of 12, 13, that sort of age group. It was a something, they were the sorts of books I really enjoyed reading when I was about that age. The Goosebumps series, but also like Christopher Pike's novels and things like that. So I liked those point horror novels, they called them, and they were, Point was the brand, I think, maybe some imprint of, I don't know, Scholastic or something. But and they were terrific. So I really wanted to do something in that vein, and I combined it with a kind of an Australian setting, and it was based loosely on maybe Phillip Island, where I went holidaying a lot. And then my next one was probably even more sort of point horror inspired, really, which was Summer's End.
I think I test read that one too. I think.
You might have.
What was that one about?
It was sort of, I mean, it's about kind of witchcraft and things like that. But Summer's End is both a symbolic thing, the end of summer being the end of the good times, I suppose. But also this town it's set in is called Summer's End. So it's this, so it's essentially about a girl who comes back after being in hospital for a while, with psychological issues. She comes back and certain things have changed slightly in the town that have this, it gives her this uncanny feel, and over time she realizes they're more insidious than she thought, and things are more dangerous, and things like that. And that one was that was interesting. That was sort of a bit of a foray, I suppose, into horror, really. So from the kind of sort of spooky stuff in the first one, but then it's a bit more horror based. And then I went on to do two spy novels. And so my wife Kelly and we traveled over to India to research the first one, and then to Central America to research the second one.
That's awesome. What was the title of those?
Sleeper and Code Name Sara Gray. So both about the character Sara Gray, and she's a teenage super spy, and she's been diagnosed with chronic fatigue, and she's always exhausted. But actually, what's happening is, when she thinks she's asleep, she's waking up, and she's going and essentially committing corporate espionage on behalf of this group. And then she starts to, there's the idea of the sleeper awakens. So there's that double, it's a play on words. So sleeper agent is one thing where they're kept in place until they're sort of activated. But in her case, it's this idea of having been asleep, both literally and figuratively, and then waking up and realizing, hold on a second, who is this other person in my mind? And then which one of them is real too?
Okay. And after that, I think you told me before that you did some interactive, things for schools and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that all came about?
Yeah, sure. So I guess one thing to say about what I've done is that, in a sense, I've got three sort of parts to what I do. So there's the creative part. There's an educational part. So being a teacher, I've been a teacher for many years, and in different settings and different age groups, but always between that sort of year 7 to year 12. So high school, what we call high school over here. So 13 to 18-year-olds, and I've taught at university as well. But then I've done quite a lot of research as well. So I started off with master education by research a while ago now, and so I was in the education area. And then I went on to do a PhD in education, and I've just finished up doing a PhD in creative writing. So essentially, that research has run alongside my creative work, which means that, and my educational work. So it means whatever I've been doing, I've been able to kind of view through different lenses, from a practical or creative lens, or, the practice of going and teaching, to then a theoretical lens, and looking at it from those views. And I think that's been really interesting. So that's my long-winded way of introducing my I suppose where I started off in games is I had always loved playing games, probably since the earliest home entertainment systems. So, and even actually my school was one of the first schools in Australia, I would imagine, to have computers in the classroom. So I think we had an Atari computer in the classroom once, and then we had a Commodore 64 in the classroom. And so we were even playing games on that back in, that would have been about 1980. 5, I'd say.
Wow.
Right. So from then, I sort of always had computers there. We had a computer at home very, very early, and we played some games on that. And then, and I remember games like Prince of Persia, the original one. We played that, really enjoyed that. then we got the first or some of the earlier consoles. So Sega Master System, I loved that with Wonder Boy and things, and then I got a Nintendo 64, which means got GoldenEye, which is brilliant, and then got Mario 64 and everything, and then went on to PlayStation, Xbox, and all that. So I guess I've grown up with games. It always struck me that there were games that were heavily story or narrative driven that were at least as interesting as the stories you were seeing on film, and later on TV, and they were very immersive, right? So if we think back to Silent Hill, for example, incredibly immersive. Resident Evil, incredibly immersive, both horror games, but that's not a requirement. I mean, that was one thing that really appealed to me about games, even if I couldn't have articulated it at the time.
Right.
So in the same way that when I started doing my research, one of the areas that I was really keen to look into academically as well as creatively or practically was this idea of narrative immersion, right? And I eventually called my company Narrative Immersion, and it's based on a term by Marie-Laurent Ryan. And I looked it up just so I have the exact term in my mind before this interview, but essentially what it means is, like you would expect, it's that idea of getting lost in the story, of being able to create a mental map of this place and this story world, right? She talks about story worlds. So before I spoke about being a world builder as well as a storyteller. And I think that is the essential thing. Once you commit to doing that, you are essentially talking about narrative immersion.
And that can come in so many forms, I suppose, as well. Like that narrative immersion, I think, is the idea. And I'd love to hear your exact thoughts on this too. But how I feel when I think about that is completely being lost in the world and forgetting that it's not the real world. It's sort of like I've talked about this with a few people, but that idea, you can have this when you're watching a film and you completely empathize, and it can make you cry as well. Like all these intense emotions, you completely forget that there's popcorn in your lap, or that there's a light on over here, or there's a baby crying over there. You're fully in the story, and nothing else matters. And that is what we're going for when we do this stuff. Is that a good way to explain that?
Oh, it's a great way to explain it. Let's put it slightly differently, right? So let's say we're making a film, right? Surely there have been times where, say, you've been watching a film. There have, for me, even when we've been making our film, which I'm sure we'll come to later, where we've laid down a track and we think, oh, that's jarring, right? And suddenly, what do we mean by jarring? We mean it brings us out of the world of the story for a moment, right? We start focusing on what's that note? What's that thing it's doing? Yeah. And we are no longer immersed. So I actually think that what you and I share as a vision for storytelling and is actually this idea of immersion. I do think that's absolutely right. And I think that it is that thing about when we know when we've done exactly what we need to do is when we are able to perfectly marry the narrative aims with when you've got the actors, the script, the visuals, and the audio, including music, all working together to do the same thing, right? Which is to tell that story and to immerse the viewer.
Exactly. That's a perfect way to put it. Yeah, I love that.
I just wonder whether I totally went off on a huge tangent and never got back to the games thing. I just want to tell people because I think this is kind of cool. I looked this up earlier. Just to remind myself of, we spoke about narrative immersion, and Marie-Laurent Ryan is an amazing narratologist, which means she studies how stories work. She has actually said, I just want to get this right, she said that when a story is really immersive, right, so we might be talking about a novel, we might be talking about a film, we might be talking about a game, the medium disappears.
Yes.
And I think that's fascinating as a way of thinking about it. So that's very much what you're talking about the crying baby and the,
yes,
things like that, the popcorn.
Yeah, completely. It's like the technology is no longer relevant to the story. You forget you're watching a movie, you forget you're playing a game, and you're just totally in it.
That's absolutely right. And
Yeah.
then what are you in? You're in the world of the film, right? So or of the novel or whatever. I guess when I was looking at games and at how they work, I was just looking at, because I was creating them more for the educational market.
Yes.
But the difference that I was able to bring, right? We always think about what difference can you bring? What's your unfair advantage? They call it in entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
Uh, Entrepreneur speak, and several of the games I've written or designed were for teaching about entrepreneurship. Those games were called Children of Dust, and the idea there was I was approached by a guy that I'd actually studied under in entrepreneurship, the entrepreneurship area. His name's Henrik Scheel from Silicon Valley, and he's he teaches. He is an investor, but he also teaches young people about how to use entrepreneurial thinking. And he'd been approached by a Vietnamese group that said, we want to teach our young people about entrepreneurial thinking and get them to practice, get them to learn English skills at the same time. So he came to me and he said, hey, Luke, this is what I've been asked to do. I have no real idea about games. Sounds like an interesting opportunity. What do you think? Would you be interested in getting involved? And I said, well, of course. I'd had a bit of experience in creating some other games for the Australian market where we'd taught maths through creating spy games. So essentially, you would act as like the handler in the van and you'd have to, maybe stop a missile strike on our main characters by using some maths theory or whatever.
Cool.
And so that was a lot of fun. And so, I created those sort of compelling spy narratives for that, worked with the artists to create really cool characters and all that sort of stuff. So when it came to the entrepreneurship games, I said, okay, well, my idea there is, yes, you could create a game about, two kids who want to start a company and all this sort of stuff. But in a sense, it's a bit pedestrian and you don't really need me to do that. You can go to anybody and get them to write that. So I said, look, instead of that, how about this idea? It's called Children of Dust. It's set in a world where all the adults, this is pre-COVID, by the way. So it's a world where all the adults have contracted an illness and they've all died. And so it's just the kids are left. There aren't that many of them. And they now have to start their society by using entrepreneurial thinking. And so again, what was I doing there? I was creating a world. And I was then getting characters to do the things they needed to do to survive in that world. And then they used the educational principles that we were trying to teach as a way to enact that change.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, we're actually family for anyone who doesn't know. So we've known each other all my life at least. But I've seen you do all this sort of stuff as I've been growing up and test reading those first few books for you. I remember your first film. I remember that being a thing. Do you want to talk about that before we get to Verite?
Sure. I mean, I think these days, my brother Alix and I, we decided, when I was at VCA in Melbourne at the time, doing my undergraduate degree and finishing that off and going to dip ed, so becoming a teacher, training to be a teacher. And he was studying as well, and he was only like 18, 19 at the time, and big fans of horror films, often independent horror films as well. So, one of our favorite films was Night of the Living Dead, the original by George Romero. We were lucky enough a few years later to actually meet him, and we were intrigued by this idea of, well, we love films. How would it feel to actually try and make a feature film? And so we set about trying to do it, and it was definitely a labor of love, but it was if I can use two cliches in one little sentence, it was like a trial by fire as well. So we were at the very start of the sort of digital revolution where you had what were called really one chip cameras, and we had no budget at all. And so we were borrowing these one chip cameras from schools to go and film, really at night. And so it was totally the lowest budget thing you could possibly find. And I guess our challenge there was to really try and create something that made sense and that had some impact. It sort of conveyed our vision for it and things. One thing I would say was that look, while the production values and everything were pretty, were of their time, what we did set out to do was to tell a compelling story. We had way more characters in it than you would, have unless you're insane. We set the entire film, during a storm, which is just incredibly difficult. So it meant, standing, we had to always have somebody standing outside the window with a hose. We became very expert in making a $2 hose, spray in a way that looked like a rain machine. That actually looks pretty good. And I would say that, despite the fact that it has its real limitations, the what I was super impressed by was, the cast, the way that they came along and the sort of sense of community they showed. And, they really stayed, that they were always super enthusiastic about it. I just saw a couple of them recently, and they're still just super positive about having been part of that and being part of that, that experience. And we all learned so much from it.
I can imagine. Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about feature films. Even if you got $1 million or more than that, it's still extremely difficult to make a feature film. So with no money, of course, you really have to be creative. And it sounds like you were. I remember hearing about that, as a kid, because the family would all talk about the movie that you were making. And when it came out, I don't think I was allowed to watch it when you actually, but that's probably because I was too young. But it probably wasn't rated. But what would you rate it if you had to, in terms of
about an M?
An M. Yep. Yeah. So, and when did that come out?
Geez, no, it would have been 20. I actually can't remember the exact year. Maybe sort of 2005, 2006, something like that. So it was sort of when I was starting, when I was getting my first novels published and things, and I kind of went off more in the writing direction at that time. My brother went more into professional editing from there. And so that's a big thing about this, of course, is that, we had ideas about, we might go straight into making another film, but actually, and use all that learning immediately. But in fact, we both went off into our separate areas. And so it wasn't for a very long time we actually got to come back together and say, okay, we have the ability to, I know that, we can put together a team of people, for example, and really direct them and keep them on track and things like that. I had confidence by then, that we could do it. And it was a lot of fun. My brother worked very, very hard on the editing and, on the editing after we'd finished up and everything. And he, was very committed to it. And look, it was fun. It got a lot of downloads on download sites and things like that. So that was cool. But certainly, as I say, it was what we would say is more like a student film, and really it set the stage for us wanting to do something that was much more professional quality later.
I found this ad.
I see things, Joe. My brother saw them too. With the right equipment, I think we can catch them on tape.
We're talking like they're real. You can't believe that. Ever thought what it would mean if it was real?
Let's get into Verite then. I know that it's going to be a big one. We've been working on it for so long. Everyone's so keen to hear about it. How did Verite begin? What was the first thing that happened with that? Like the conversation between you and your brother, maybe?
Gee, that was a very, very long time ago. So we we finished up When Evil Reigns, around 2005, 2006, I believe. By about 2010, we had, or maybe 2008, something like that. It was really, really long time ago now. We actually had the concept for Verite already. So it was an idea that we thought would work. And we even wrote a script for it. We had a bit of a cast that we discussed and everything. And we actually even had an option at one stage. And as soon as that happened, they were talking about us not directing it anyway. Right.
Right.
So So that was something we sort of didn't really want to go down that route anyway. I ended up going to England for a while. As I say, I mean, I had my career in teaching and writing. My brother had his career in professional editing, and so really once it kind of got went into that area and it was in a bit of a holding pattern there, we it just we let it kind of go by for many years, and then finally, I think, whether it was me or him, one of us just said, look, if we're ever going to do this, let's just make it ourselves. I had been hanging out at that time. So Luke Toniolo and Nikachevsky and some other people came along and they said to me, hey, Luke, could you write us a script, sort of a spec script for maybe a web series or something like that? And so I did that. And then they kind of put together some people to shoot that and things, and that was sort of, it had some interesting potential and things, but didn't quite go, the way that they were perhaps looking for. But through that, I did meet a bunch of these, young, say cinematographers, sound recordists, assistant directors, and all these people, and I went to the rehearsals as well. And I was just really impressed with them, So they'd come along there, and they were very committed and everything. They were very, very skilled. I could see that. And so while that project sort of didn't take off, I was also impressed, of course. I felt Luke he's an interesting young guy. So he's very he's very charismatic, so he's able to sort of to meet a lot of people, to bring a lot of people on board with things, and I thought he had some real potential as an actor. He'd been doing a lot of modeling at the time and was just getting into acting, but I felt that he had a lot of potential in that area, and that he really just needed somebody to help him, to sort of direct him a bit more and things, and I thought he could have something really special. And Nick, basically, he has this intensity about him straight away, and so I thought, and when I looked at them standing next to each other on the set of that sort of show, that webisode or whatever, web series, I thought, I reckon I'm looking at the cast of Verite, actually.
Wow. Incredible.
And yeah, and then my brother, he was cutting together an audition tape, I believe it was, or a portfolio for a young woman, actress named Sungarai Wachanuka, and he said to me, you have to check her out. She look at this performance, right? And so I looked at it and I just thought, gee, she is excellent. Like, she is an excellent actor. There's no doubt about that. And I've always been able to spot when somebody is good, even if they're being totally underutilized. I've always had a good eye for that. And I thought, okay, she needs a better script. She needs a richer role than that. And let's see what she could do. So basically, although we actually had auditions and we looked at a lot more people, I think I kind of knew in my heart from the very start who I wanted to cast in those three roles. And that I would just work with them, anything that any sort of hesitancy or weaknesses or whatever they might have, due to a bit of a lack of experience, we could get over those, because real key to any sort of filmmaking, I think, is this idea that, and we have this with everybody, when somebody would come along, because people often think, oh, you had no budget, so gee, it must have been hard to get people to work on this. No, it was actually really easy, because once people see that you have a vision for something, and they see other people who are involved, and maybe they're friends of theirs and things like that, they do start to see the opportunity that it could be. And so we actually had a lot of people offer to be involved. And eventually what I had to do is I had to say to them, okay, well, here's the script. Why don't you go away for a couple of days and then come back to me and let me know what you think of the script, where you think you can offer things and things like that. And some people didn't read the script. Some people didn't. They maybe skimmed it and they didn't really get it, whatever it was. They would come back and I'd just say, well, I just don't think we're not quite connecting here. Whereas Luke, Nick, Sungarai, the eventual cinematographer, gaffer, right down to people working, on sound. They were familiar with these characters. They could talk to you about the characters, their motivations, their as cliched as that sounds, it is a real thing. But they could talk about, they could ask you about the backstory. They could talk about what the things that we are not seeing, how are they influencing the things that we are seeing and things like that. And so those were the rich conversations we were having that were really narrative driven conversations the whole time. And that was as much how, in a sense, we worked out who to work with as anything else.
And you did a lot of rehearsals for this one.
Yeah, that was one of the things we learned from When Evil Reigns. You can't, particularly when you're working with people who don't have the experience, and that includes us, right? That includes us as the directors, and we, or people who maybe they're experienced now. We have people who are a bit more experienced, but they're more experienced in working in that sort of commercial area. There are going to be particular things we'll come up against. So yeah, we had as many rehearsals as we could manage. Certainly quite a few with the actors, which was so important. And right there, it was that whole thing about, the temptation maybe when you're starting out is we'll rehearse every scene. It's like a play, but actually that's not the way you need to do it. The main thing is there are going to be some key scenes where characters sort of come to the fore, where they're doing something unusual or something that's going to be really important for their character. You need to make sure that they've nailed those particular scenes. The other things you can kind of work out as you go, I think a bit more, but or of course, if there are scenes that are going to have really complicated blocking and things, you definitely need to rehearse those scenes. And we had stunt people in one of the scenes as well, so that had to be rehearsed separately.
Yeah, and I can imagine as well, like, there's particular parts in, say, a scene where, two people who have to look like they know each other very, very well. And if the actors don't, then that can be hard to fake. So having rehearsals, I suppose, would help with that too. So for that familiarity between the actors that then, translates to the story and shows that, hey, these people have been friends or have known each other for a long time. Moving on into, like the tech side of things, how long did production actually last for?
The primary shoot or principal photography would have just taken, I think it was about 4 weeks, something like that. So it wasn't very long.
Did you do it straight?
Mostly straight, yeah. But then over the next 6 months, just picking up a few things. So we'd have had had a scene at an electronics shop. We had those sorts of things. We had a scene at the wrestling here. Melbourne City Wrestling, I believe it's called. Perhaps Melbourne Championship Wrestling, I'm not sure. But we had a scene with them up in Thornbury at Thornbury Theatre and things. So those things had to be shot. They weren't going to be done at the same time as the principal shoot, where really we were shooting at the apartment and these key, these sort of signature, locations. These were things that had to be done, over the next few months. But everything was wrapped up in terms of filming, definitely within that 6 month. I mean, I was amazed at just how good the locations were that we ended up getting. I mean, there are some where you'll never notice that they are a different location at all, right? So the bathroom, for example, is somewhere out on some farm,
Okay.
But you never know that because it just matches with it ties into the apartment scene seamlessly, right?
Yes, definitely.
And then there were, I felt that. Look, basically, nobody, when we asked to go to places, nobody ever said no. Let's put it that way, right? So we ended up with all these terrific locations that are real, they're real places. There's nothing here that's shot on a set or anything like that. I mean, we probably couldn't afford the set anyway, but so it means that we're in places like a real local supermarket, a little supermarket, like almost like a bodega type thing, and it's just a real place. And they gave us the run of the place, after hours. We're in real cafes, we're in real, and these places, and people were really willing to do that. They got on board with it. They often even sort of sponsored it on that night. So they were not only giving you this location, but they then say, hey, listen, can I make everyone food for that night and stuff like that? Like,
wow.
People were incredibly generous. So that's one thing about it, that as long as you kind of as long as you're polite, you're honest with people and clear about how long you're going to be there, you're respectful of their place, you can generally get. I mean, the amount of stuff that we were being given or was pretty incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds amazing. What about other areas of the production during that month? Is there anything you maybe haven't talked publicly about, or want to share about the experience there with the actors or crew, or just anything during that time? What was something that stands out in your memory?
I guess the main thing that stood out for me was just the sense of camaraderie that was on set. So there was that, like I'd go home every night. I would have been working for, I don't even know how many hours it was, right? Like one day I arrived there and I had my bag on my shoulder. So I'd come from like just a couple of K down the road and to the apartment where we were shooting. And a couple of the cast members, I think, were actually staying there at the time. They'd sort of just be there at night as well. But anyway, we were getting ready to start for the day, and there were already 15 or 20 people there, and then people started asking me questions, and it was an hour and a half later that I realized my bag was still on my shoulder, right? Like I was, there
Hadn't
was
even
just
stood in yet.
no time.
Wow.
Yeah, everyone just needed everything. They had so many questions and everything. But once we got down to shooting, that was done. It was like people were focused. They were they were supportive of each other. I was just super, super impressed with the commitment shown and the maturity and and that support shown for each other was amazing.
That's incredible. I think that also translates into the movie as well. That sense of community there that you're talking about. With that comes I mean everyone respecting the project as well and doing everything they can to make sure it's great and that shows. So I mean I think that's a huge thing to achieve on the set of a film because there can be disasters and things that happen that you can't avoid, but at the same time, when everyone comes together with the same goal, that's when it's magic.
I think that's right. But I think that sometimes people think that somehow this is going to happen by magic, right? And it doesn't, that this is part of, you mentioned the rehearsals before. There was also the fact that, we wrote out, I think it was 10 points maybe that were like guidelines for behavior, basically, where we really thought about it. And, we said, like no drinking during shooting, no that certain like language and the way people treated people, these sorts of things wouldn't be tolerated and things like that. And look, maybe that was a little bit influenced by some people who were going to be involved who then weren't, but actually that was a boon for us. That was a help because it meant that when I was there on set, I didn't have to worry about people, the way they were talking to each other and things like that. I felt, as I say, when I was looking around during that time that I was there, I was like, okay, I can feel confident that people are being respectful towards one another and things like that. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a workplace.
Yeah, that's right. But it also becomes a family, I guess, after so much time together as well. Like, when everyone is doing the right thing and coming together this way, it becomes like a family. I've definitely noticed that on sets when I've been there. And I'm not normally on sets. I work in post majority of the time, as you know. Maybe let's get into that then. So, the editing process, how long did that take? Because I know Alix was working on that for quite a while. He did such a great job.
Yeah, he's done an amazing job on it. He's he's very, very skilled. And I mean, look, I can't say the exact amount of time. There were a couple of things that got in the way, so that shouldn't have taken as long as it took. Wouldn't have usually taken that long. And I mean, one of the things being COVID, of course.
Yes.
But so we actually had some things that were just outside our control, unfortunately. So I'm not sure that necessarily the amount of time that it took is representative of anything.
Sure.
But what I would say is that the amazing thing about Alix is like he's so dedicated to his craft, really, that it's almost frame perfect. So I mean, look, I'm sure there are things here and there as there always are. My stuff still has spelling mistakes here and there, but it's so meticulously done that then when it comes to, say, doing the sound and the other things, you're never grappling with something that is sort of that's half baked.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. There are so many times I can think of, throughout just watching it, even the first time I watched it, just the rough. and going, wow, like they've already done so much attention to this one aspect or something like that. And there were plenty of times like that where he tried to, at least make a start on this is what I'm going for. And he like completed that. Like that's finished. There are, I think, a lot of times we even used that as the final. Like there's nothing I needed to do for the sound mix. So like, he did an excellent job completely. Let's get into the sound then, because I mean we've obviously talked about a lot of other things to do with Verite, but my role, for anyone who doesn't know, was the sound designer, sound mixing engineer, re-recording mixing engineer, and we've gone through so many learning experiments as well, and just different periods of like working out what this film is going to be to do with sound, like relating to sound. So initially, if you remember, we were talking about, okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to mix the film. Cool. And all I had at the time was stereo, and that was just the norm. And I was like, okay, I've got a studio. We can do it. And then I think as I sort of progressed in my role, with other films and other things while I was waiting for Verite to be ready because I'd already signed on. I think, so I became aware that 5.1 was like the industry minimum for distribution, international distribution, and things like that. And it was like, okay, we need to do that. That's like a standard. And so we were all learning together. And I remember having so many conversations with you about this, just going, okay, what do we need to do? How can we make this the best it can be to make sure it really hits? And all this awesome effort is not wasted with something as simple as that. And very quickly it turned into, well, I'm going to go to 7.1. So we ended up converting everything I'd done halfway through the film 5.1 to 7.1 and added, more things. And then, later we ended up at Dolby Atmos as well, which is a completely new change again. And that's a massive one. And this is actually my first feature film that I've, committed to doing, Dolby Atmos for, and there's now another one I've got in the works as well, which I've started on as well, and then there's a third one coming in the near future as well. So that's insane. That's just my journey through the stereo 5.1, 7.1, and then Atmos. What was your memory around that? And could you tell people about how we got to that? Anything I've missed, maybe?
I think that's pretty good praises of the sort of journey we went through. I guess from my personal perspective, this has probably been the biggest learning curve that I've had as part of the film, right? Because if I think about like all other areas, writing a script, done it before, but, putting together a team, I've done that in other settings, say with the games and things, designing, doing the character design and things like that and make sure costumes right and things, done that with games and things. So while those things are all complex, I've kind of had that experience before. And, I mentioned at the start of the conversation, that I started off by doing writing and drawing. And so I've always thought visually. The biggest change for me in my thinking has occurred during this part of the process, right?
With the sound mix.
Where I now realize just how crucial sound is for creating that sense of narrative immersion that I have always been seeking.
It's a massive part of it. Well, I know we've had plenty of instances where it's kind of been like a eureka moment during this. If you remember what I'm talking about here, we've been sitting in the studio and we've kind of had like these happy accidents happen as well. And it's sort of, that highlights like how much better something could be when you may have already thought it was finished, and you go, all right, it's great. And we watch something and then you might change one thing, maybe by accident, or you just try something new with the audio, and it gives it a whole new feel. And we're just like, oh my God, how do we not think of that before? And it was a complete accident. And we just go, yep, that's got to stay in now.
We'll often take that learning and put it back into previous scenes as well. And, Robert Rodriguez talks about the three parts of filmmaking being money, creativity, and time, right? And we have no money. We have And so that means we then have to use the others. We have a lot of creativity, and we've given ourselves a lot of time. We could have given ourselves less time; we'd have had to use more creativity. But anyway, that's okay. We've reviewed both these things.
Yes.
Those are the resources we have. So that's what we've used. And we are very lucky that we have actually, so much like Alix and I we're very simpatico when it comes to the editing side of things. He does it, right? He is the technician, but he shares it with me, and I say, hey, what about this moment? Can we? He'll have it like 90% as I would have done it anyway. So what about that moment? Is there a way to show that she thinks this, or that look, I just think we're focusing a little bit too much on her at this stage. Can we bring in this thing, or can we cut to? I remember we had a shot of such and such. Can we bring that in actually? Because I think that sort of symbolically, is more representative of what we're going for. And he'll say, oh yeah, great, yeah, I have that, and so we bring that in. But it's like, so he and I are very simpatico in that way. You and I, we've realized, are very simpatico in the sound way. And there's almost no time where I'm like, oh no, it's not what I want to do. But actually, if it isn't what I want to do, then I say that too. So there's nothing in the film that is ever going to be not what I think is the best thing for the story. I mean, and one thing I want to come back to, I think, the way that we've done that, but just one thing, because I had the thought before and I forgot, and now I've remembered. And I think it is important for this part of the discussion, is this idea that when you start off when you write a film, in a sense, the script should be a perfect representation of the thing you want to create, right? The script should work. We wrote a script that worked. It worked as its own product. Yeah. And I say that as a published writer, right? I know it was a good script, and I know it worked as a story, and it created these characters, and it had, sort of symbolic resonance and all that sort of stuff by the end, right? It worked as a script. You then cast, you do rehearsals, you bring the cinematographer and the gaffer and to create the visuals, and everyone else who's involved with that, the people who are helping the camera and everything, maybe camera operators and people. You then bring in people to record the sound. You make sure that the production designer has the right, found the right locations in our case, and then the production designer does their job in making sure the right colors are in the on the screen at one time for mise en scène and things like that, right?
Yep.
And then you come to this part of the process, and you have the combination of music, sound effects, maybe use of silence, things like that, and other subtleties around sound. And all of that is done, these layers and layers and layers on top of each other, just so that hopefully, eventually, you get back to the one thing that you had at the start, which is the story.
Yes. Yeah, that's
kind of fascinating to me.
Oh, me too. Yeah. So, well, I mean, that's a really interesting way to put it as well, because we feel like we're building this whole time, but then really at the end of it, it's too, like, all of those things are there to strip themselves away and make the audience forget they're watching a film again. Like we said before.
Yeah, absolutely. That sense of immersion. Exactly. That's what we're hoping for, right? I mean, I get that a cinematographer could watch it and they'll say, wow, didn't Victor do a great job on that shot, right? Or didn't Anton like that scene beautifully, right? Or oh wow, Mark wrote that, gee, look at that bit of music there, isn't that great, right? Or Alix, wow, the way that those, the sort of, he looks at that and then it cuts to this and that, yeah, great. Well, wasn't that,
That's besides the point, though, if they're looking at that.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So if at the end of the day, I think that hopefully what we do is we create something that's really seamless enough that the things fall away and people are just immersed in the world of the story.
Yeah, completely. And I think maybe it is a good time to talk about the Dolby Atmos journey, and maybe why we've ended up with that. This whole importance on which format and all the tech deliverable requirements and all that stuff. None of that really matters if you're talking about the story, but they matter because I think why they have those requirements. I think the reason is because they're trying to have a sort of standardized way to make sure that everything is as immersive as possible, right? So Dolby Atmos's whole point is not about how cool it is moving around you and flying over your head. It's not about that. Everyone thinks it is. And of course, that is really cool. But it's not the point. The point is to make you completely immersed in a sense that includes all of the directions that your ears can detect, so that the audio experience is as lifelike as possible. And then also the scalable thing about it, which I talk about in almost every episode. The scalable thing is it means that everyone can enjoy that no matter what system they have. So that's removing the technology again, making it just about the story. Because ultimately, the point of Dolby Atmos is you make it in the highest format so that when it scales down to lower formats that people might be watching on, could be stereo, could be 5.1, 7.1, or sound bar or on their headphones. But it scales down in such a way that like the director's vision is captured and still intact, no matter where you listen to it. And that's the point. That's what we're trying to do. Like have that immersion no matter what. Dolby Atmos allows us to do that, and that's why we ended up doing that as we went through from, like I said, we started with stereo. And then we were like, oh, we need 5.1, so we'll do that. And at that point, it was just a tech deliverable. It wasn't about, it was just like we have to because that's what the standard is.
Yeah.
But then as we kept going, it was like, how can we make this better? How do we remove this need for 5.1 or stereo? Or it shouldn't matter. It should be about the story. Dolby Atmos fixed that for us. And that's why it was an obvious choice to do that when it became available and optional. So I think that's, for me, my work, that's why I have put so much time and money and, and learning into making that part of everything I do, because it ultimately does what you're talking about. It removes the tech and, embraces the story in the best possible ways.
The temptation is to think about this as maybe as a gimmick, right? But what I would argue is that the term that they use, spatial audio, is the key, right? When I'm talking to people about what comics are, I say to them, what do you think it is? And they say, well, like it's words and pictures together, right? And that's true. But the one ingredient that people forget that is so important to the way that comics are constructed is the page itself and the relationship between things. So in fact, the third ingredient is the spatiality. Right, the spatial arrangement of things on the page that creates meaning, and it's really, really important. And so while we've been doing this journey with the audio, I've actually been doing research into how spatiality works in comics, and those things have complemented each other, right? Again, like so much of my work, the research and the creative and the education, they all merge at a certain point. They dovetail, right? And so I now have a much better understanding of exactly how spatiality works in a two-dimensional medium, but I've also thought quite a lot about how it works, say, in games. I've thought about how it works in virtual reality, which I've also written for, and things. And now we've been able to think about how is it going to work in this medium of film. So how can we use it not as a gimmick, but as you said, how can we use it to better tell this story, right? And so there are questions there, for example, about, okay, we are surrounded by audio now. We're not just it's not just coming from here. Now that we're surrounded, when we are surrounded, are we in a sense perceiving the world as a character? That's something that we can do with this spatial audio more effectively than we can do by having it come towards us from the screen, given that implies that it reminds us that we are sitting back here and we are separated from it.
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
So there, it's an example of that immersion and being surrounded by it literally, and then it's going to the top of you and all this sort of stuff. But it's more than that. It's a symbolic thing. And in that particular case, it's about subjectivity, but it can be about a range of things. And we've tried to use it in a range of different interesting ways. And I reckon it's something that people are going to be pushing further and further and further as time goes on. As I say, this is the area of greatest, learning for me in this whole process, probably. If I was going to go out and shoot a film tomorrow, though, I'd have you or somebody like you on board from the start. So I think that where we've ended up with Verite is with the absolute best product we could. So I'm confident about that. I think that every aspect of it is as high quality as we possibly could have done. And that includes the sound. So, but I think that now that I understand that sound is just as important as visuals and just as important as the writing part of it, I would just approach filmmaking differently, where I would just see it as being part of it from the very, very start.
Yeah, that's a very interesting one. I think, probably I've heard a few filmmakers talk about that process where, sound designers or even composers come in very, very early and start working with, the idea from the script before they've even shot anything. Sometimes I've actually done some work before where, I've created a sound effect to be played on set for the actors to actually really react to and things like that.
Yeah.
And stuff like that can really elevate it. So you kind of know what you're building, like you do when you're about to, go and shoot something. You've got that end result in mind, and you're crafting it from the script, but you've got storyboards or whatever else. But yeah, the sound becomes part of that in one of those things that you kind of already know. So yeah, it can definitely work to do that, and I think you've kind of got something there. That it's an interesting one to think of it that way. Whereas you sort of do typically think of it as a post-production thing. But it's not always the way.
Well, because if you think about, the reality is whenever we're directing, even, when we're probably even when we're writing, but, rehearsing as well, he's always thinking like an editor, really. So he's always thinking about how to cut it together eventually.
Yes.
Robert Rodriguez talks about that as pre-visualization. So if there are particular things that that you want to try, or that you think, oh wow, wouldn't this be amazing? You'll know about the technology and the potential for the technology, the things that people aren't yet doing, and then you can say, hey, Luke, what about if? Oh man, I'd love to hear such and such done. It's not about saying when they do whatever, let's do it this way. No, that's fine. I can work that out. But it's about saying, I want to I want to hear this. I want people to experience such and such. And then I can kind of put that in the storytelling process and say, okay, now how do I, in that particular scene, I think it's going to work if we do it in this way. So it actually can ignite possibility, right? And I think that's the fascinating thing about, say, the spatial audio stuff is it is fundamentally different, actually. It's not just a gimmick. I know that they said the same thing about 3D films, but I always felt they were pretty gimmicky, actually. And I'm still yet to be convinced that they're not, even if Martin Scorsese makes one of them, right? I'm still yet to be convinced. Whereas this is different. And I can say that as someone, I can say it as a storyteller, I can say it as someone who has sat in that chair listening to what's happening. I know that it is fundamentally different from that.
Yeah, that's a really important one, actually, because I do. That's one of the biggest questions I get from people, like trying to learn about Dolby Atmos or what it is, used for, why we need it. And I suppose the thing right there is that, it eliminates the need for anything else. That's the whole point. It doesn't need to be anything specific. Whereas the problem with previous formats, and the same problem with, say, the 3D stuff, is that it requires a certain technology to achieve it. Dolby Atmos is relinquishing that. That's like the answer to that problem. So I think the whole point is, again, to remove any obstacles that would previously stand in the way of achieving that immersion. Whereas, now we have a tool to make it not matter as much, where it carries through no matter where you're watching it. That's not true for the 3D stuff. You do need the goggles, and you do need the double camera thing to get that. And it is cool, and it can be, but it is a gimmick, in a sense, because you can still tell a great story without it. But the audio side of this is actually fixing the problem. Whatever you have is good enough, and it will translate. And that's the whole point. So more people can enjoy this in the best possible way.
Half my career, right? My research, literally one of, my thesis was called The Role of a Writer in Creating Narrative-Driven Digital Games, right? It's really, it's been about narrative immersion. It's also been about, that idea of things being narrative-driven. Yeah. And if we put it that way around, the thing is, what I just always ask somebody is the narrative driving the technology, or is the technology driving the narrative?
Yeah, definitely. I think, we better wrap it up pretty soon. But before we go with Verite, let's just talk about that again really quickly. When do you think it's likely to be coming out? I know we're very, very close.
Very close on the sound side of things. I'd say, I would say mid 2025 is probably a pretty good bet for it being in festivals, or having some other sort of release, whatever sort of release it has.
Yes. Yeah, cool. And what's the best place to find out more information about that when it does come out?
Sure. Just go to the website, veritemovie.com, or follow it on Instagram, Verite Movie. News will be put on there.
Absolutely. Cool. And if you do want to hear more about Luke's work, go check out his website as well.
Just lukecjackson.com.
Let's wrap it up there. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man. I really appreciate it. I've been trying to do this for a while, but yeah, it's a lot of fun chatting to you again.
Absolutely. It's been great. Catch you later.
See you, bro.